Every single year, every single team has a little bit of pressure on them to either suck so bad they get a top 10 pick or to try and compete for championships. Well, today I want to talk about 5 NFL teams that in my opinion have the most pressure to succeed in the 2024 season. So this list will consist of 5 teams, again, that have the most pressure to win next year, not lose next year, but to win next year. Let's talk about it. We are going to start off with the New York Jets, and by the way, these will not be in any particular order, so just take them as they come. But we are going to start off with the New York Jets. Again, these will not be in any particular order, so the New York Jets are going to start off this video. My opinion, the New York Jets have a lot of pressure on them because of number one reason, Aaron Rodgers. Anytime you have an older quarterback such as Aaron Rodgers, who's still basically kind of in his prime, you have a lot of pressure to try and succeed right away. Not to mention, this is not a particularly young team per se. Like, yes, they have some younger players, like Quinnen Williams is not that old, Garrett Wilson, Breece Hall, Sauce Gardner, those younger guys are still fairly young, but of course, when you're starting quarterback who is, as I mentioned earlier, a really awesome quarterback, and Aaron Rodgers is almost 40 years of age, or is 40, the pressure to try and compete now is going to be there, and it does not help this team when you look at the rest of the AFC, and there's also a bunch of teams within that conference that also have a ton of pressure to try and win now as well. In fact, 4 of the teams on this list are going to be coming from the AFC, so there's a lot of teams with a lot of pressure, which means there's a lot of teams who are going to be trying to compete against the Jets to make the playoffs and have deep playoff runs. Now, of course, every single team has pressure on them, but I think this team in particular has a different type of pressure on them just due to their overall age. Again, I'm going to say this over and over again, when you have an older quarterback like Aaron Rodgers, especially for a Jets franchise that has really struggled to get good quarterback play, it's important to try and capitalize on that quarterback play while you have it. If the Jets had a backup plan per se, like let's say hypothetically they drafted a quarterback in this year's draft, let's say JJ McCarthy for example, then I don't think they would have that much pressure for this current season, but that would just be the fact that they have a young guy who can come in and someday be the starting quarterback, so there's a lot less pressure this year and a lot more pressure within the next 10 years. But because the team doesn't really have a set in stone backup plan at the quarterback position, there's a lot of pressure for this team to try and succeed now. Next up at number 4, we're going to talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars. Now, it is no wrong saying when we say that the Jacksonville Jaguars were one of the more disappointing teams in 2023. After dominating the AFC South in the 2022 season, the expectations for last year was that they were going to continue to dominate the division and be the front runner for the next several years. And if we go back in time, prior to this actual season, we were looking at the Texans as potentially being the worst team in the division. We were also looking at the Colts and saying that they had a long time until they would become who we thought they could be. But unfortunately for the Jacksonville Jaguars, those teams have really stepped up and have really turned into some really good rosters. You look at Indianapolis and Houston, and I personally believe that both those teams are true contenders in the AFC, whereas I look at a team like Jacksonville, who last year again disappointed, and I look at them with a bit of a different light. I think Jacksonville is a tad bit underrated next year, but when you look at their schedule and you also look at the rest of the division, I have a really hard time saying that Jacksonville is going to be a true contender in next year's playoff run. And that to me is basically why I think this team has a ton of pressure on them. They have a franchise-altering quarterback in Trevor Lawrence who hasn't really necessarily lived up to the number 1 overall pick expectations we had on him, but has still panned out quite well, especially when you compare him to the rest of the quarterbacks within that draft. And looking up and down the roster, it's a pretty solid roster all around with some really good skill positional players next to Trevor Lawrence, a solid enough offensive line, and a decent enough defense to get the job done. And when you are falling behind in your division, the expectation should be to continue to try and compete against those guys and hopefully be able to come out on top of this division. In my opinion, I don't believe this team will come out number 1 in the division. I would probably lean right now towards Indianapolis or Houston, but I think the expectation within Jacksonville is to try and get the number 1 seed within the division and try to compete deep into the playoffs. Again, I think a lot is on the line here for both Trevor Lawrence and Doug Peterson and a lot of individual coaches and individual players on this roster. This team is talented. They have everything that you really would want in a roster. Now is the time to try and go out there and compete. Unfortunately, it is a tough conference and a tough AFC South, but when you have the talent, the expectation should be to try to win. I think they have a ton of pressure heading into the 2024 season. Next up at number 3, we're going to be talking about the Cleveland Browns. Now, I made a Cleveland Browns video a few weeks ago, and it kind of runs on the same sort of premise, but I'll just kind of summarize it here. If you guys want to see a deeper breakdown into the Browns roster and what I think about them, I will have it pinned up at the end of the video, so just stay tuned to that if you do want to see that video. But for Cleveland, it's really quite simple. You are basically an established roster with a good mix of younger guys, but a more bigger mix of older guys. And the big question for this roster really comes down to, can Kevin Stefanski and can Deshaun Watson get the job done? Obviously, Stefanski has been one of the best coaches in the NFL the past couple years, and last year, they were one of the better teams in the NFL despite having a onslaught of injuries the entire season. And while I personally do believe that this Browns team could potentially be one of the top teams in the AFC next year, I don't quite know if they have what it takes to win the AFC in totality. And that really just comes down to the fact that I just personally do not believe in Deshaun Watson because, quite frankly, I have no reason to believe in him. Thus far in his time with the Cleveland Browns, he has been relatively disappointing, and I wouldn't say that just because he hasn't played well on the field, but it's just been his overall availability. He's had season-ending injuries, he's had seasons within the injury, and when he has played, it hasn't really been the Deshaun Watson that we wanted to see. And I personally do believe that this could be his last year on the team if he does not reach the expectations that they had for him when they traded for him. And again, going back to what I was saying at the beginning of this is an older team that doesn't really have a lot of time to just be sitting around and continue to lose in the playoffs or lose in the regular season. This is a team that, as we saw last year, can make it to the playoffs and can be competitive with every single team. But the real question can be, can Deshaun Watson, number one, stay healthy, but when he is healthy, can he step up to the plate and be the top tier quarterback that this team needs? And number two, can this team continue to step up in the playoffs and play better when they get to that postseason run so that they can make that deep run that they want to hit? Again, as I said, for all the teams in this list, on this list so far, it is a tough AFC, and especially in the AFC North, it's going to be very difficult. But when you have a roster such as the Cleveland Browns do with so much great talent and great players, the expectation should be to win now, and I just don't know quite yet if they're going to be able to do so. Next up at number 2, we're going to talk about the Baltimore Ravens, and a lot of the same principles for the Browns also does apply for the Baltimore Ravens. However, there are some key major differences, and that being that I actually do believe in Lamar Jackson, and that I do genuinely do believe in this Ravens roster more so than I do for the Cleveland Browns roster. But the big reason why, in my opinion, that they are in this video is given the fact that they have been in this situation the past couple years where they have been able to try and compete for the division and try to compete for the conference, but they have not quite yet been able to get the job fully done. And I think there's a lot of questions that have to be answered for this Baltimore Ravens team, such as can they replace the guys they lost in guys like Geno Stone and Patrick Queen, and can the additions of guys like Derrick Henry be enough to get this team over the hump? Obviously, it's a tough task for any team in the NFL to try to compete with the Kansas City Chiefs, especially when they are as dominant as they have been the past couple years, but I do truly believe that this Baltimore Ravens roster has what it takes to get the job done. They have an MVP level quarterback, one of the best head coaches in the league, a top 5 defense, a really good offensive line, and now a fantastic running game. And when you also take into the account that you're probably going to see some progress from guys like Zay Flowers, who hopefully can continue to turn into that receiver one that this team needs, I really do believe that this Ravens roster has what it takes to win the championship. But unfortunately, as of right now, we just don't know if they can get the job done when it matters most in the postseason. They have a loaded roster with a good mix of young guys and older guys, but can they get the job done in the postseason? We'll have to wait and see. Lastly, before I move on to the last team, I will say about this Ravens team that I don't know if they were to lose this year or not have the productive season that we think they can be. I don't necessarily know if they're going to blow it up, such as some other teams on this list, but I would definitely imagine that they would probably have to take some different chances and some different options because as of right now, it has not worked. But at number 1, my only NFC team on this video is going to be the Dallas Cowboys. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a bunch of other teams I could have included in this list, such as a team like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers and a couple other teams. But in my opinion, these 5 teams and this NFC team in specific has a lot of pressure on the line this season. And that's just because the Dallas Cowboys are kind of an older-ish roster. They have a bunch of guys who are currently in their prime who are also seeking long-term deals. Last year we saw Trevon Diggs get paid, and currently as we're talking, CeeDee Lamb, Dak Prescott, and Micah Parsons, 3 of arguably the best players in the entire NFL, are all seeking long-term deals. And fortunately for Dallas, you do have these guys under contract this upcoming season and likely going to be for the next several years, but the real question becomes, can those guys get the job done? Because as of now, it has not led to any sort of success in the postseason. As we all know, the Dallas Cowboys have consistently shown that they can be one of the best teams in the NFL in the regular season, but when it gets down to crunch time, when this team needs to make plays in big moments, in big games against really good teams, and of course, in the playoffs, they have yet to be able to do so. I feel like last year was a really good description of who this Dallas Cowboys team really is, because last year they dominated every single bad team in the NFL, sometimes by more than 30 plus points, and the second they went up against a competent roster such as the Buffalo Bills, the Niners, and so on and so forth, they continued continuously struggled, and we saw that again in the playoffs this year. And for this Cowboys team, they had a relatively quiet offseason, not really making any big time decisions or directional moves. They really just kind of stayed put with the current roster and let a bunch of guys leave the team that were maybe getting paid a little bit too much for their liking. And I think there's a lot on the line this upcoming season for not only this coaching staff, but a lot of the players and of course Jerry Jones. When you have the talent of this Dallas Cowboys team, and trust me, you may hate this team, but they have a bunch of really good players, there's going to be a ton of pressure for them to try and succeed. And in my opinion, if the Dallas Cowboys do fail to make a deep playoff run or to have a really successful season in their own eyes, then I could imagine this team being one of the few teams that genuinely does try to fix their issues. Now, I'm not saying they're going to completely blow the roster up, because quite frankly, they should not do so, but I would imagine that the number one thing they'll look to address will be the quarterback position and the head coaching room. Me personally, I don't feel like this Cowboys team has too many personnel issues. Like, yes, they need more depth in a lot of other positions. They need a new running back. They could use some influx of talent within the safety and linebacking room, but I still feel like overall this team should be able to win a championship. The question becomes for me, like, who is going to be the head coach of this team that can get the job done? Because quite frankly, I don't believe in Mike McCarthy. But you guys tell me, do you guys agree with the teams in this list? And if you enjoyed the video, hit the like and subscribe button, and I love you guys. Peace.